The creation of the Sahara Desert was so profound that the Africans realized, I guess it's time for us to get up and find a new place to live. And so those Africans that were on one side of the Tamanrasset River, from the Atlas Mountains, they traveled north. The other Africans who were on the other side of the river, they traveled southwest, following the same sands where Cape Tamaris is. And so what they did, these Africans, they started, give or take 3,000 years before the Common Era, maybe 2,500 years before the Common Era. They had established what was called settlements. Dartichet was one, Darwalata was one, Dartangent was one. Settlements of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And what they did is that they consolidated their settlements into one because they were so expansive, and they started a city, a kingdom that's known as Wagagu.
The Berber tribes, dispossessed and driven southwards by the Arabs, made room for themselves at different periods in the Fertile Belt, and in doing so, necessarily fought with and overthrew or were overthrown by the blacks. This resulted in a very great admixture of blood, and though the black strain would seem generally to have prevailed in point of colour, the characteristics of the races occupying the Fertile Belt were in the course of centuries so modified that in speaking of them, it will perhaps be more accurate to employ the word black than the in many ways misleading term of Negro. The true Negro is hardly to be found amongst these races of the northern inland belt, the cast of face, even when jet black in colour, being frequently European in form, with the high nose, thin lips, and deep-set eyes, characteristic still of the Arab of the Mediterranean coast. In the year 1067, Ghana was still the principal black kingdom of the Western Sudan. The name of its reigning sovereign was Tenkamenin, who ascended the throne in the year 1062 in succession to his maternal uncle, Bechi. It was the custom amongst these blacks for the succession to go always to the son of the king's sister. The Black Kingdom of Ghana, already famous in the 8th century, had risen in prosperity and importance and had spread northwards, conquering amongst other territories the kingdom of Audagast. In the year 1054, the town of Audagast, still rich and flourishing, not only acknowledged the rule of Ghana and paid tribute, but was also a place of residence of the Black Monarch. But in the following year, 1055, the Almoravides, already setting out upon their northward march, made a first example of this town. They took it by assault and sacked and pillaged it, exposing it to every horror of barbaric warfare. And it is especially stated that they treated the population of Audagast with this extreme rigour because the town had acknowledged the sovereignty of the Black King of Ghana. The town of Ghana, which after the sack of Audagast kings was composed according to El Bekri of two towns situated in a plain. One town was Mussulman and the other pagan. The king himself was a pagan and lived in the pagan town. The Mussulman town was very large and contained no less than 12 mosques. All these mosques had their imams, their mueddins, and their salaried readers. There were also schools and centres of learning, and according to the author of the Tariq-es-Sudan, the town, besides being the meeting place of commercial caravans from all parts of the world, was the resort of the learned, the rich, and the pious of all nations. This account is fully borne out by later writers. El-Idrisi, writing in 1153, describes the king's residence as being a well-built castle, thoroughly fortified, decorated inside with sculptures and pictures, and having glass windows. El Bekri makes no mention of glass, but says that the king's residence in the pagan town consisted of a castle surrounded by native huts. He mentions that the buildings generally were composed of stone and acacia wood. The native town was 6 miles distant from her Mussulman town, but the whole space was covered by suburbs, consisting of stone houses standing in gardens. In the native town, there was one mosque for the use of Mohammedans occupied on duty round the king. The king's principal ministers and advisors were at this time Mohammedans, and he and his heir presumptive wore Mohammedan dress, but the religion of the country was still devoutly pagan, and all other persons of native religion, except the king and his heir, wore robes of cotton, silk, brocade, according to their means. The local religion, evidently different from the paganism now practiced among the lower class tribes upon the coast, had yet certain points of resemblance. The wealth of the country was very great. The soil was fertile and gave generally 2 crops a year. Gold was abundant. The custom, according to El-Bekri, was that all nuggets found in the mines of the empire belonged to the sovereign, while the public was allowed to keep the gold dust. Without this precaution, El-Bekri gravely states, gold would become so abundant that it would have hardly any value. The nuggets found in the mines of Ghana varied usually in weight from an ounce to a pound. Some were much larger. The king had one which weighed 30 pounds. There was a part of the country called El Ferouin, in which gold was so plentiful and salt so scarce that salt was sold for its weight in gold. It was indeed a fine movement of historic fate which caused the conqueror of Ghana to become the instrument of the foundation of Timbuktu. The prosperity of Timbuktu, says the author of the Tariq-es-Sudan, who was himself born in that town in the year 1596, was the ruin of Ghana. Before the great days of Timbuktu, Ghana, he tells us, was the centre of the Sudan. After the rise of Timbuktu, all was gradually transferred. Timbuktu drew to itself not only the wealth, but the learning and enlightenment of the civilized world, and became the home of all that was pure, delightful, and illustrious in the Sudan.
Wagagu. Ghana is Wagagu. Ghana was the name of the king. It wasn't the name of the country. And so you have what we today call Ghana, but Ghana becomes Mali, and Mali becomes Songhai. But the reality is that Wagagu and what we call Ghana existed thousands of years ago. Because they want to go to the medieval period and say that's when ancient Ghana started. That's not when ancient Ghana started. Ancient Ghana was in existence thousands of years before that. And so that when you have this West African impact, West African civilizations, you then have people coming from other parts of the world coming in, invading, and then claiming that they wrote the scrolls of Timbuktu. But the scrolls of Timbuktu had been written for thousands of years. They just took claim to the fact that they did it. So we don't, and then cultural interpretations, they don't know what they're reading, so they start talking this nonsense about what they think they're reading, but you need the African people with an African mindset, with an African cultural common sense, that can then interpret these scrolls for what they really mean in terms of their interpretations. And so when we're looking at West Africa, and we're looking at these 3 kingdoms, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Almoravids, and the Almohade, that's why it's important to understand by the time you get to the Almohade, these are the people that are going to do battle with some of the Almoravids, and that is what's going to eventually destroy the Moors. And by January 2nd, 1492, Boabdil is going to be expelled from Granada. And that is when the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon are going to take over. They're going to take over all the castles that the Africans had built. And then they're going to build a process of the development, of the destruction, of the credit to give to African people, which sprinklings of Arabs who had adapted to the African traditions.